Let me narrate a scenario where India gains entry into the G7 summit as a full member, considering the geopolitical landscape as of June 12, 2025, and explore its potential effects on India and the world. Since India is not currently a G7 member but has been a frequent guest, this will be a speculative narration based on recent trends, India's global standing, and the G7's evolving dynamics. On June 7, 2025, just days before the G7 summit in Kananaskis, Alberta, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney extended an invitation to Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, despite earlier uncertainty and strained India-Canada ties. Modi accepted, marking India's continued presence at the G7 as a guest for the sixth consecutive year since 2019. The summit, set for June 15 to 17, 2025, brings together leaders from the G7 nations, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the UK, and the US, along with the EU and invited guests like India, Brazil, Mexico, South Africa, Ukraine, and Australia. India's inclusion, driven by a strong push from the G6, as noted by Veena Najibullah of the Asia-Pacific Foundation, underscores its economic significance as the fifth largest economy, $3.94 trillion, and its strategic role in a multipolar world. India's journey with the G7 began in the early 2000s when it was part of the G8+5 under Prime Minister Manmohan Singh. Since 2014, Modi has leveraged these invitations to amplify India's voice, particularly as a representative of the Global South. At the 2024 G7 summit in Italy, India pushed for initiatives like the India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor, IMEC, and the Lifestyle for Environment, LIFE campaign, aligning with the G7's Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, PGII. In 2025, with Canada hosting, the agenda includes the Russia-Ukraine war, West Asia tensions, climate change, AI governance, and economic security, issues where India's perspective is increasingly valued. What is the significance of the G7 invitation for India? India's consistent G7 invitations enhance its global diplomatic clout. As a guest, India can influence discussions without the binding commitments of full membership, preserving its strategic autonomy. At the 2025 summit, Modi is likely to emphasize India's role in the Indo-Pacific, advocating for a free and open region amid China's assertiveness in the South China Sea, a concern shared by G7 members, as seen in their 2024 criticism of China's harmful overcapacity. India's participation in the PGII, which aims to mobilize $600 billion by 2027, could accelerate infrastructure projects like the IMEC, boosting connectivity and trade with Europe and the Middle East. This aligns with India's economic goals, especially as it attracts investment as an alternative to China, with companies increasingly looking to diversify supply chains. However, India's guest status highlights its delicate balancing act. Its per capita income of around $2,000 contrasts sharply with the G7's $50,000, $80,000, reflecting developmental disparities that limit India's integration into this developed country club. India's neutral stance on the Russia-Ukraine conflict, abstaining from Western sanctions while increasing Russian oil imports, may create friction with G7 members pushing for unified action against Russia, such as the $50 billion loan to Ukraine from frozen Russian assets. India's ties with Canada remain tense due to the 2023 Hardeep Singh Nijjar killing, and while Carney's invitation signals a desire to reset relations, posts on X indicate skepticism in India about Canada's commitment to addressing Khalistani separatism, suggesting that bilateral progress may be slow. How India's presence could affect the world. India's presence at the G7 injects a global South perspective into a forum often criticized as elitist. The G7 represents 10% of the world's population, but 45% of global GDP, a share that has shrunk from 70% in the 1970s as emerging economies like India and China rise. India's advocacy for food, fuel, and fertilizer security, amplified during its 2023 G20 presidency, resonates with developing nations impacted by the Russia-Ukraine war. For instance, India's push for redirecting funds from frozen Russian assets to support vulnerable economies beyond Ukraine could gain traction, addressing global inequities in crisis response. Strategically, India strengthens the G7's efforts to counter China. The G7's focus on the Indo-Pacific, including initiatives like the PGII and IMEC, aligns with India's role as a regional balancer. However, this risks escalating tensions with China, potentially deepening global divides. On climate change, India's participation pressures the G7 to lead by example. None of its members are on track to meet 2030 emission reduction targets, aiming for 42% but projected at 33%, while India has met several COP commitments early. Collaborative efforts, such as Italy's Mattei Plan for clean energy in Africa, could expand with India's expertise in renewable energy markets, fostering global sustainability. Yet, the G7's reluctance to expand membership reveals its limitations. Despite India's economic and strategic weight, its inclusion as a full member is unlikely due to economic disparities, and the G7's preference for maintaining a Western-centric framework. This perpetuates the narrative of a Western elite club, as the G7 excludes major economies like China and Brazil, fueling the rise of alternative groupings like the expanded BRICS, now including Saudi Arabia, Iran, and others. The G7's informal structure, lacking a formal charter, also limits its ability to enforce decisions, which may frustrate India's push for actionable outcomes on global challenges. Does India being a regular invitee indicate a shifting global landscape? As Modi prepares for Kananaskis, India's G7 engagement reflects a world in transition. For India, it's a platform to amplify its voice, secure economic benefits, and navigate complex geopolitics, balancing ties with the West, Russia, and China, while championing the global South. For the world, India's involvement signals the G7's attempt to remain relevant by engaging rising powers, though its failure to reform risks ceding influence to groups like BRICS. The 2025 summit may mark a step toward broader cooperation, but underlying tensions between India and Canada, the G7 and China, and the West and the global South suggest that the path to a truly inclusive global order remains fraught with challenges.